Hello, this video is for the characterStats lab assignment. These for the SGD 113 class. As you can see, I've already set up the user interface in the same way that it was defined in the screenshot provided with the lab directions. I have, just to highlight them quickly, I have set up in the main panel, I have set up the title for the text, which just states characterStats. The label panel here is this top row that describes the headings of the columns, basically name, health points, magic points, strength, and defense. And then I have a text for the names, and then notice how it's got different rows of text. Same thing for the health points. It's an entire column. The magic points, strength, and defense, and all of those are set up in their own text. Then there's the quit button, the bottom right corner, that will be active at all times. The read button, which is going to be available, but should become disabled whenever, or not interactable whenever we've entered already 6 names. And then, so that's about all we need for that read button. The gen button is the generate stats button. In that case, it'll generate statistics for all of the characters' names entered at the time the button is clicked. And then there's the clear button. When that is being done, we're just going to empty out the information on the screen by modifying the arrays. For this one, we do not want to use a scene reset. That means we're not going to reload the scene as we've done before. We're just going to remove the data that's been provided for the characters. And then, of course, you need a name input here where the user will be allowed to enter the different names. And the statistics will be done automatically once that generate stats button is clicked. So hopefully you've been able to work on the setup of the user interface. There's also a little error text here, and all you have to do is select the color to be red for it, and we'll display errors from the user input. If the name has more than 6 characters, we will return an error in that text. And then if there is no name entered, but the user clicks on the enter name button, then we will also provide an error message. So let's begin by adding some functionality to our lab characterStats. I'm going to, well, I've already created a script folder here, and I'm going to create a C# script that I'm going to call game controller. All right, I might as well, since I'm at it, add an empty game object. I'm going to rename that game object game controller. And I'm going to reset its transform. Since it's an empty game object, it's kind of good practice to clear up the transform so that we have it set up at the origin. And then I'm going to attach the script to it. Now there's nothing in my script. I'm going to open it up. There it is. So let's begin by declaring our public variables here. We're probably not going to need the update. We can always add it later on, but it's a good practice to get rid of it if you are not using it. Otherwise, it will be called every frame, and even if there is no code to execute, that's a bit wasteful. So the only variables that we're going to use that are going to be public are going to be used for the user interface. That's per the directions there. So let's take a look at what we're going to need. When it comes to the buttons, we're going to need to make the name button and the generate stat button available or not. And then also, I think that's about all for the buttons there. So let's get a reference in Unity, and let's maybe use a header for it. I forgot my parentheses. We're going to type in buttons, for the name of the header, and then underneath we're going to have the couple of buttons that we're going to use. So the first one would be, and of course when I type button, I see that I get no help from Visual Studio. One thing that you may want to check when Visual Studio stops helping you, make sure that your modal behavior here is still showing in a different color. If it turns back to black, chances are there is no synchronization between Unity and Visual Studio. Just close Visual Studio, reopen the script, and hopefully I'll fix the issue. But here I have no issues with modal behavior. However, for the buttons to work, I need to add a library, which is Unity engine.ui. You're already familiar with this. So now when I come back here, well, it probably won't help me for the first one, but it recognizes a keyword button after that. So there is the read button that we're going to hide or disable whenever we've entered 6 names. And then also the generate stat button. We're going to need to have at least 1 name before we can generate any kind of statistics. So I think that's all we're going to need for the buttons. We can always come back later and add some more. Another thing that we are going to need is the input. So let's add another header for the input, even though we only have 1 variable there. So we're declaring an input field, and then we can give it a name. Name input would be a good name for it. I think we're going to need next a reference to our texts. And so to do that, we're going to use an array of text. That's going to make it maybe a little bit easier. And then we'll make sure we add some comments so we know what we've initialized. But ideally, we want to have an array for the health point text with the magic point text, the string text, and the strength text, sorry, and the defense text. So those are going to be needed. And we might as well just put them into an array there. So we are going to declare this array of text element, and we'll initialize it in the inspector. Maybe we're going to call it the text array. You could call it something else if you wanted to, and that will have our different text for the different statistics. I forgot to add a header for there. And there we have it. All right. So let's save our script and initialize the variables, especially for the text array here. That'll be kind of and I could add a comment here that it will include the health point text, the magic point text, the strength text, and the defense text. So that's what we're going to add into that array there. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 elements. Let's go and initialize that in the inspector. That'll give us a chance to see what an array looks like in the inspector. So I need to select my game controller here. Give it a minute to all right. So we have the buttons. Let's deal with those. There's the read button and the generate stat button. That's pretty simple. For the input field, I need the one for the name. So here is my text array that I was mentioning before. This is what arrays look like in the inspector. You may have seen them before. And so here the size says 0. So because I mentioned we needed 4 text element, I can just enter 4, and it gives me 4 slots already. I could also select the text and just drag and drop them on the array as well if I selected all of them. So I'm going to show you the way where I set up the size here to be 4, And then here I can add the different texts. So I said the first one will be the health points, kind of try to be in the order. Then there's the magic points, the strength, and the defense. So that's one way you can initialize your array. Another way, I just reset it back to 0. I could select, well, first I'm going to lock the inspector here for the game controller so that when I select something else, I don't get new information in the inspector. So that's one thing I need to do. Then I'm going to select by pressing Shift, selecting the first one, pressing Shift, darn it, selecting the first one, pressing Shift, and selecting the last one, and just drag and drop them on the name of the array. So here on text array, and automatically it initializes those values for me. So we've initialized our variables, which is good. Let's move on to adding more code here to our script. Before we go back to the script, let's make sure we unlock the inspector for the game controller here, so that if I select another object, their information is displayed. Here is the script. Now let's work on declaring other variables. Those will not be public, so they will not be seen in the inspector or will not be accessed from other scripts. Although we only have one script, so we don't need to worry about that. You will eventually, but not yet. So 3 arrays. One is actually the array for the text objects. We've already done that, so we don't need to worry about it. Let's declare the array with 6 elements for the names. So this is an array of string. We're going to name it names, and then let's not forget the keyword new string, and then we provide the size here. Remember that when you're declaring array, you have to specify a size. If nowhere in your code or in the inspector you have set a size, then your array will not work. It will give you a null reference exception or something along those lines. So that's the array for the names. Next, we need to declare a 2-dimensional array of integers. So this tells me it's a single dimension array. To tell it has 2 dimensions, I just need to use a comma, and that specifies 2 dimensions. Maybe we're going to call it stats. And that's a new array of integers, and we need 6 rows and 4 columns. All right, and then the last variable that we need at the class level will be something to count how many players we have entered. So this is a simple integer. I'm going to call it number of players, and then we'll initialize it in the start. All right, I think that's all the variables that we need to declare here. In the start, I'm going to make sure I initialize my number of players to 0. Next, I'm going to need to initialize other things for the gameplay per se. So at the beginning, if we're looking at the interface here, for a minute, enter name needs to be available, but the generate stats button needs to be unavailable. So let's make sure we go back to our script and make that clear that the gen button set the interactable property to false, and that way it will not respond to clicks and it'll be kind of like grayed out at the beginning. I think that's about all the initialization. Oh, and then there's the error text at the beginning. I don't really need to have, but I didn't define the error text. Let's do that. I almost thought I was done here, so I need to make sure I declare one more text. I'm going to call it the error text. And then in the start, I'm going to set that to no errors displayed. So error text.text, and set that to the empty string. This way it doesn't look like there is an error from the get-go. All right, I think I have defined pretty much everything that needs to be initialized in the beginning. Let's do the simple stuff with the events. So let's do the events for the buttons, and then we'll figure out what needs to go in there. Those need to be public because I need to be able to see them from my buttons, and the buttons are not in the script, so I have to make sure that they're public. So there's going to be the on read button click. I forgot the return type. That could be helpful. So make sure you don't forget that return type here. It's getting late, maybe. At least that's my excuse. Then there's another button. So public void on generate button click. That's my second function to respond to the click of the buttons. There's going to be the clear button. On clear button click. That's going to be called from there. And I can't remember if there's any other buttons. One way to find out quickly, there's the enter name, the generate stats, the clear, and then there's the quit button, which is the one I'm missing. So let's add that event as well. I'll try to be consistent in my names here. On quit button click. All right, so I'm not sure what's going to go in there, but at least I have my functions defined for handling those click events. And then I could create custom functions there. We'll see that as we move along. But at least I have all my events, and then if I wanted to have some custom functions, they could come afterwards. It keeps our script organized right from the get-go. All right, so let's move on to the buttons that are easy to handle. Well, the quit button is pretty easy. So we're going to print a statement. That lets us know that we've actually connected our button correctly. And then application.quit we're going to call whenever that happens. So we're going to start with the on read button click. And it kind of makes sense because we're going to enter names before we can generate stats or do anything else. So that's where we're going to begin. Now, if you're looking at your instructions, it does say that we have to make sure that the names are no longer than 6 characters. And then also that the name was actually entered. So let's work on this, and let's work on the error text as well. And then we'll test that out to see if it works. So first I have to get the information that was entered in the input field. I'm going to store that in a variable, and I'm going to use a string. Maybe I'm going to call it input. And then I'm going to read the information from the name input. So that reads whatever is entered inside the input field. Next, I need to check. So first, I can check if it's empty. So if input is the same as the empty string, that means, and that's just opening and close the quotation marks for an empty string. That means I didn't enter any text, so in that case, no text entered. So have a little comment there so we know what we're doing. So my error text should be pretty simple. Now, it should be simple, but it should be specific. We can't just type in error. We have to be breaking it down a little bit in small chunks for our users. They may not be able to figure it out that they didn't enter anything. That was the issue. So we're going to assume they can't figure out what they did wrong, and we're going to be very specific. So error is the first thing that we're going to tell them. And then here, name was left blank. Or you need to enter name. Or something like that. So that they know exactly what they did that was wrong. They probably already know, but why assume that they know? Next case. Now we're going to check if our input has more than 6 characters. Now, if you remember, we've done a little bit of string manipulations before. And when we started talking about arrays, we mentioned this length property, and we also mentioned that it kind of works for the strings as well because they're kind of like arrays of characters. So I can use that information by checking the length of the input, and if it's greater than 6, it can be 6, but it can not be anymore. So in that case, I can enter my error text.text, and again I could just type in error, but that would not be very specific, and the assignment tells you to be specific, and also you want to be specific. The more feedback you provide to your users, the more they'll enjoy playing your games or running your applications. So here, name is longer than 6 characters. Ideally, we'd have instructions there for the players, but that's something for you to improve upon and add those. All right, and then the next case, well, we're not equipped just yet to be doing anything more specific than that. So we are going to just assume here input is valid. So let's use that. Let's make sure we set the error text.text to say nothing, because if they've had an error before, we don't want that to show up on the next time where the information is correct. We want to remove that. And then let's start working on adding the name that was entered into, I think I called it just names. There it goes. So names at the position of number of players, which at the beginning will be position 0. And then we're going to assign the input there. So if it's the first time I'm entering something, then I'm putting it at position 0. Let's not forget to increment the number of player by 1, since that means I've just added one number. Now what we want to do is after I've entered a player, I can start already generating statistics. So I'm going to enable the generate button so that I could start, even if I only have one player, I can start generating statistics for it. All right, one more thing that we need to do is if we've reached 6 players, we need to make sure we disable the name input button. So I can write here if the number of players is greater than or equal to 6, and then we'll make sure we are including the proper number of players there. In that case, the read button is no longer interactable. All right, so I'm still missing a little bit of information here. I'm missing writing the names in the text. I'm going to do that in a little bit. But for now, I should be able to enter some names. If the names are too long, then I should get an error message. If I forget to enter a name, then I should get an error message. And then if I enter a valid input, then in that case, after 6 of them, it should not let me add any more. So let's save this for now, and let's test what we have now. I know there's a user input portion, not the user input, but the user interface that we have not updated. And I think I'm even missing my name text here, but I'll fix that in a little bit. So let's press play. And I can see that I'm getting an error, which is great. I love getting errors, and I keep them on purpose because this way you can see that we all get errors when we are running our code. Null reference exception. Now you should be very familiar with this. Object reference, and when I double click, it takes me straight to the error. That saves a little bit of time. But if I look in the console, it tells me also that this is happening on line 28 of the game controller. So I can go back to my script. Here's line 28 that caused the error. And then null reference exception means I don't know what error text is. And if I look at my game controller object, which is the one that has the script, I did not initialize my error text. That's the one that I did later on. And I kind of forgot to initialize it, so there's no problem. That happens. But you have to be able to identify where your errors are coming from. So the error text is in here somewhere. All right, let's try this again, shall we? All right, generate stats is not available. I can try to click enter name. Nothing happens. Oh no, what happened here? I'm pretending to be panicked, but I know exactly what's going on. So when you see that there is no event or there's nothing happening when I click on a button, and I don't even get an error message in the console, that tells me something is just not connected. And that's the first thing I need to check is my button connected? So if I look here on my name button, which is the read button, I can see that there's no event selected or associated with it, or event handler. So here I need to find my game controller, or I can just drag and drop it. And then I should be able to find in the script my on read button click. The second thing that you can look for, now here we've figured out our problem, is to make sure that you have an event system and that your event system is working. So right now it's in the scene here. How can you check if it's working or not? Just press play here. And with your event system selected here in your inspector, at the bottom you should have, well, sometimes it's opened up, sometimes it's not, but you should be able to drag here and open it. There it goes. And then when I hover over the interface or click on things, it should start. You can see it's getting the position of the mouse, the change in between each frame. If I click, it's going to tell true. And then here actually I get my error message now. So that allows you here, when you're taking a look at that information, it gives you a clue whether your event system is working or not. If nothing happens with your event system, then delete it and put a new one in. And you can find that under a game object UI. There's the event system there. Sometimes students delete it accidentally. They're like, what is this? Oh, they delete it. And then sometimes it just quits working correctly. Maybe you use different versions of Unity. I don't know what the case could be. But either way, you can check that it's actually working. And usually that should fix most of your UI. You've connected the buttons like they should be connected, and your event system is there and working. Chances are there could be also a panel overlapping your buttons or your input. And in that case, you would have to make sure you move that panel away, or you put it behind so that it won't bother your events from registering. So here it's working. If I enter no name, if I enter a super long name, is that more than 6 terms? It should be. It tells me name is longer than 6 characters. And if I enter Sam, seems to be working, and generate stats is available. Now if I click on generate stat, I know my click is working. You can see the event system there showing that it's working, but there's nothing happening because number one, I have no code in my function. Number two, my function is not connected to the button. Now one thing is I could just keep entering the same name, and then enter name is not available, but I don't want to let the user do that. So in our script, we're going to remove the text once it's been entered here, which is basically when the information has been entered correctly. Maybe even here, actually. We're going to make sure that we're removing the text that was entered by the user when the name entered is longer than 6 characters, even though they're going to need to modify it. And then I'm going to place that also here, and then we can save and then take a look at what happens. So if I were to run, oh, my UI is gone, there it is. If I were to run this project and enter a very long name, Click on enter the name. It tells me it's longer and the text is gone. If I enter something correct and I enter it, the name is gone. Of course, it's somewhere. It's in my array there. But I'm going to need to make sure I display it in here. So that's going to be our next step. Let's work on printing the names in here. So at first there's going to be only one name at a time. If I look here, I'm going to get one name at a time. And every time it'd be good to redisplay all of the names. Now I only have one text for all of them. And we've done that before, loop through an array to get all of the names and display them. So we're going to end up doing that. Let's create our own function. So we're going to create a function that's going to return a string and that has all of the names concatenated for us. So let's do that after all of the event functions here. Now my function can be private. It will only be used inside this script. And I said it was going to return a string. And then I'm going to call it maybe print names. So if you remember a function that returns something, I declare a variable of that data type. Maybe I can call it to return. And I'm going to set it to the empty string. There's several ways I could loop through the array. I could do a for each loop. Yeah, I'll do a for each loop for this one, and then for the other ones with the statistics, we'll use a for loop. It might make sense. So let's do the for each loop. For each, I'm looping through the array of names, so it's going to be strings. I'm going to call it an element, and then in, I'm going to provide the name of the array, which is names. Let me bring my code a little bit up. So in that case, I'm going to do to return is going to be incremented by the element. And then I need to put a next line kind of character so they're not all on the same line. I think it's this one. Yep, it changed color, so that's the correct one. There he goes. And then once I've added all the name, I need to make sure I return, not the read button. I returned the to return string here that I just created. There it goes. So now I can call this function. Remember about returning value returning functions is whenever I call them, I have to have something to catch whatever they're sending back. So let's move up here where I have the functions. I'm going to update my name text every time I'm entering a name. When I'm just thinking now, actually I don't have a variable for the name text, do I? I do not. So I have the array of text with the other values, but I do not have the name text. Let's make sure we add that here. I'm going to call it names text. And then hopefully I'll remember to initialize that in the inspector. Otherwise, I'll get an error and then I'll have to figure out how to fix it, which is not the end of the world. So names text now can be set to some value, and I'm going to call the print names function, and that string is going to be displayed in the names text. Okay, let's test it out. This way we can see if our names are actually working. That's great for the script. Let's go ahead and select the game controller. Now we realize that the names text does not have a value assigned, so we fix that quickly. Let's run the code and test that it works. So I can already enter some names that are correct, and I see Sam is being added. Here's another name. I don't know if I'll have the patience to enter correct names all the time. And now I can no longer enter any names. I have 6 of them. It looks very nice and it works. Now I've got to start having everything else work here. That reminds me here, when I click the quit button, I was kind of expecting it to work. It doesn't work because I didn't connect the button. Let's do this here. Let's connect the buttons since we are at it and thinking about it. So the generate stat button, there it is. Let's add the functions. I believe we've created all the functions. Let's select the game controller and click for the on generate button click function. The quit button, let's do that one. Select the game controller from the scene. Select the game controller script. And in there, we're looking for the quit button click event. And then there's the clear button, which right now has no functionality. We're going to have to sync this one through. But for our clear button, we had the function created with no code in it. So now if I were to click, nothing really will look different. I could put the names again. And I told you I was not going to have the patience to enter names correctly, and I should count how many characters I put to help out. Generate stats is not doing anything, but that's okay because I didn't have any code. Clear is the same. The quit though should display a message in the console because I had that debug statement to print that information. All right. Let's go back to our script and let's focus on the generate button click. So here we're going to need to initialize, if you remember, our array of statistics. I'm looking for it. There it is. So this array here, it has 6 rows and 4 columns, 6 rows for 6 potential players. However, we're not necessarily always going to have 6 players involved. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure we only initialize values for however many players we have in the game. So let's go back down to our generate button click event here. And we're going to do our for loops, nested for loops to go through the rows and the columns. So let's start by setting up the rows. And I like to use R, but you could use other variables. We're going to start for the first row, which is a position or a value 0. And then the number of rows, we're going to limit that to however many players we have entered so far. So this is looping for each row, and for each row I need to deal with all of the columns. So I can use another integer, maybe C for columns. C in that case is going to be less than the length of that array because we're going to provide the 4 columns really. So we are going to use stat.getLength1. So if you remember, getLength is going to return the length of one dimension in the array. GetLength0 will return the number of rows, and GetLength1 will return the number of columns. So that's exactly why I'm using this here. You could use 4, it'll be fine. I don't like using hard-coded values, so that's one of the things that I don't like to do there. And then I just need to initialize my stats array, which I just called stats. Now for the row and the column. And then here we can use random.range. And I think we are to pick a value between 10 and 99, is it? Let's do 10 and 100, and then we'll double check the directions in just a moment here. So that should generate all the statistics that I need. I'm not seeing any information just then and there. In any case, you know how to do the random.range, so you can modify those values there. I don't want numbers that are 100 or more because they're going to start taking more space and my interface is going to look goofy. And I don't want to have to deal with managing that. All right, so I've generated the array. And now, of course, when we're clicking for that array, we're displaying at the same time. So what I need to do here is work on displaying this. So first, let's work on creating a function for it, kind of like we did with the names. It could return a string, and we're going to call it print stats. So now let's start thinking about that for a minute. I'm going to have different stats entered in different texts, and so I'm going to have, if we go back to the text array here, for my text array, I'm going to have 4 texts for the health points, the magic points, the strength, and the defense. And each of these represent one column, the value for one column. So I'm going to create a function that will return one stat. So here, print stat, maybe I'm just going to put it singular here. And then here, maybe I need to specify which one. Am I going to print the one for the health point, the one for the magic point, the one for the strength, or the one for the defense? So ideally, I would want to use a value that's, I'm going to call index, maybe, or stat index, let's call it. And then I'm going to put a little comment here. Stat index will be 0 for the health points, 1 for the magic points, 2 for the strength, and 3 for the defense. Okay. So the reason why we need the stat index, I'm going to go over that in just a minute. As you see, the code will make more sense. Let's declare that string to return. And let's set that to the empty string to get started. Now what I want to do is I want to print the same stat for different players. And so that's kind of why I need the stat index there, because in that 2D array, I'm going to pick whichever stat I'm interested in. So the column is going to be given, and that's why I need the stat index there. But then the other information for each player, that's going to be what I need to be looping through. So I'm going to loop through my rows. And I'm still going to use the number of players here because I don't want to go above whatever was entered for the number of players. And then here R++. So I'm going to use the to return. I'm going to increment that by the values in the stats array. Now the first coordinate is going to be the row, and that's the player, so that's R. And then the column, I told you that's the stat index that we want to use here. It's going to be 0 for the health points, 1 for the magic points, etc., etc. All right, so that should give us the statistic for that particular player. And then we're going to make sure we also put a next line item or character there so that they get displayed in a different line each time. When that's done, I can return that value. There it goes. Now I have to figure out how to call this, which is really not that difficult. So let's go into back into our event function for the generate button click here. We've defined the positions. Now it's time to update the text. So if we remember, we had a text array for each stat text. That's where they were being stored. So we're going to loop through those. We can do a for loop using I for index. That's fine. Here we're going to make sure that we stop at the length of the text array. I think that's what I called mine. So I'm looping through the array is of texts, and then I'm going to do a text array at position I dot text, and I'm going to assign to that the print stat for the same index. So they're kind of like matching in their index there. Let's save this and let's test it out. See what we have. So I'm going to enter 3 names for testing purposes, and I'm not going to spend times really entering any valid names. And then I'm going to click on generate stat, and I can see I have some values. I don't get any errors here, so apparently things are working well. If I were to add more people, whoop, too many characters selected, and I can click on generate stats, and it gives everybody new statistics. And there it goes. And if I click on generate stat, every time it gives me new values. There it goes. It seems to be working correctly. Now we have to use the clear all button, and then we'll revisit the assignment to make sure we've met all of the requirements for that. So let's go back to the script and work on our clear button click. So if we think about the variables here that we have, let's think about what we need to clear exactly. The input field, not really. We do need to clear out all of the values for the text arrays. We need to clear out the error text message, but that should be happening already. We need to clear out the text for the names. And then we need to remove the names from here, change the statistics back to the default value in the array. So the names will be empty strings, and then the stats would be zeros because they're integers, and then reset the number of players to 0, right? That's kind of what we did here. So I guess I can reuse what I had in the start here. I'm going to copy them, and I'm going to paste that into my clear button click event. Then I'm going to create some functions to clear the arrays. So let's start with the name array. It's not going to return anything. Clear name array. It's not going to take any arguments, and basically what we're going to do here is we're going to set each name back to the empty string. So for each values between 0 and the length of that name array, which is name.length for me. I need to put a little space here so that it looks a little nicer. So here names at position I, and I'm going to reset that to the empty string. I'm going to create a function also that's going to be clearing the statistics. Now here, if you remember, that's a 2-dimensional array. We kind of went through earlier the kind of loops that we're looking for. I'm actually going to copy that loop there where I generated the values. I'm going to do the exact same thing here. I'm going to go through all of those, and then here I can actually change this to the stats dot length. Oh, sorry, not dot length, sorry, dot get length. And then the first dimension is the rows. Same thing for the columns, and instead of initializing to a value, I'm going to give them all the value 0, which is the default values assigned in an array of integers. And that'll clear up my array. So let's do this, and then we'll clear up the UI. So I'm going back to my clear button click. I'm going to clear the name array. I'm going to clear the stats array. And then I have to make sure I clear the UI elements. So I could create a function for that. Or I could just have the code here on the clear button click. I'm going to put the code here. But you could create a function for that. So let's check out. We have really, going back up here, we have to clear out the text array for the 4 different outputs, the health points, the magic points, the strength, and the defense, and then also the names text. So the names text is probably going to be the quickest to do. There it goes. I set it to the empty string. And then I can do the same thing for the others, except that it's an array of text. So I'm going to do a little loop to make it a little bit more efficient. I'm trying to remember the name of that array. It was text array dot the length, and then I++. So I'm going to loop through these 4 UI elements by doing text array at position I dot text and setting that to the empty string. Okay, that should do it. Let's check it out and see if we've missed anything here in clearing up our array. Now I'm going back to the number of player being 0 also, making sure of that. Let's get back to Unity. Okay, I'm going to enter a few names. There we go, generate the stats for those guys and then clear. I don't get any errors. My generate stats button is no longer available. I can click enter a name, but it's not working. Put in some names. These are some terrible names. Once I've entered 6, it's no longer available. Generate the stats for them. Clear them. Uh-oh. I'm having a little issue now. My enter name is no longer interactable. And that makes sense because I've entered all 6 names before, but I've never reversed that. So let's go back to our clear all. And that's why you kind of need to test out your code several times. Wherever I generated the button or had the generate button become interactable, no longer, I'm going to make sure my name button, which was the read button, and then set that to true so I can re-enter names, especially if I have entered 6 before. So let's make sure that fixes our issue. When I get back into the editor, I'm going to make sure I enter 6 names here to disable the button. There it goes, generate stats just for the fun of it. And then clear all. Look at that, my enter name button is available again, and the quit button is still working. So I think that's pretty much all of the requirements for this assignment. I'm making sure I didn't miss anything. That looks about right. So hopefully this helped you complete your project. Thank you for your attention, and until next time.